KaraokeBooks.
In Search of Lost Time. Swann's Way. Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K.Scott-Moncrieff. But if anyone had suggested to my aunt that this Swann, who, in his capacity as the son of old M. Swann, was fully qualified to be received by any of the upper middle class, the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go into abeyance, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some drawing room on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes. That would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristeas, of knowing that he would, when he had finished his conversation with her, plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an empire veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or, to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the plates we used for biscuits at Cambrai, as the thought of having had to dinner Ali Baba, who, as soon as he found himself alone and unobserved, would make his way into the cave. One day when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, and had begged pardon for being in evening clothes, Françoise, when he had gone, told us that she had got it from his coachman that he had been dining with a princess. "A pretty sort of princess," drawled my aunt. "I know them," and she shrugged her shoulders without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely ironical. Altogether, my aunt used to treat him with scant ceremony. Since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations, she thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send to him whenever we wanted a recipe for some special sauce or for a pineapple salad for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, not seeming of sufficient importance to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the House of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we, and don't want to, do we?" my great-aunt would say tartly to Swann, who had, perhaps, a letter from Twickenham in his pocket. She would make him play accompaniments and turn over music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang. Manipulating this creature, so rare and refined at other times and in other places, with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with some curio from the cabinet no more carefully than if it were a penny toy. Certainly the Swann who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days differed hugely from the Swann created in my great-aunt's mind when, of an evening, in our little garden at Cambrai, after the two shy peals had sounded from the gate, she would vitalize, by injecting into it everything she had ever heard about the Swann family, the vague and unrecognizable shape which began to appear, with my grandmother in its wake, against a background of shadows, and could at last be identified by the sound of its voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole, which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is created by the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is, to some extent, an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the creature we see with all the ideas we have already formed about him, and in the complete picture of him which we compose in our minds those ideas have certainly the principal place. In the end they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose, they blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice that these seem to be no more than a transparent envelope, so that each time we see the face or hear the voice it is our own ideas of him which we recognize and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swann they had built up for their own purposes my family had left out, in their ignorance, a whole crowd of the details of his daily life in the world of fashion, details by means of which other people, when they met him, saw all the graces enthroned in his face and stopping at the line of his arched nose as at a natural frontier. But they contrived also to put into a face from which its distinction had been evicted, a face vacant and roomy as an untenanted house, to plant in the depths of its unvalued eyes a lingering sense, uncertain but not unpleasing, half memory and half oblivion, of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners, round the card table or in the garden, during our companionable country life. Our friend's bodily frame had been so well aligned with this sense, and with various earlier memories of his family, that their own special Swann had become to my people a complete and living creature. So that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person when, going back in memory, I pass from the Swann whom I knew later and more intimately to this early Swann. This early Swann in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my childhood, and who, incidentally, is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time. As though one's life were a series of galleries in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, the same, so to speak, tonality. This early Swann abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur, and with whom, because of our caste theory, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests, the Marquise de Villeparisis, of the famous house of Bouillon, this lady had said to her, "I think you know M. Swann very well. He is a great friend of my nephew's, the Delames." My grandmother had returned from the call full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens and in which me. De Villeparisis had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter, who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming. The girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor a most distinguished man, the finest she had ever seen. For in her eyes distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made, saying to Mamma. Sévigné would not have said it better, and, by way of contrast, of a nephew of me. De Villeparisis whom she had met at the house. "My dear, he is so common." Now, the effect of that remark about Swann had been, not to raise him in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower me. De Villeparisis. It appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, we owed to me. De Villeparisis imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in her duty in becoming aware of Swann's existence and in allowing members of her family to associate with him. How should she know Swann? A lady who, you always made out, was related to Marshal MacMahon. This view of Swann's social atmosphere which prevailed in my family seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst class. You might almost say a fast woman, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to us alone, though he came more and more seldom, but from whom they thought they could establish, on the assumption that he had found her there, the circle, unknown to them, in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that M. Swann was one of the most faithful attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the little details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Mole, the Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, however, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swann, for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, was condemned to utter degradation in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of those friendly relations with people of good position which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit, for my great-aunt had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer we had known because he had married a highness, and had thereby stepped down, in her eyes, from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen or stable boys mostly, to whom we read that queens have sometimes shown their favors. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann, when next he came to dine with us, about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. On the other hand, my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty ambition, who for that reason were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be called the pinchbeck things of life, even when they had an historic value, or, generally speaking, in anything that was not directly associated with some object aesthetically precious. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly a part of our everyday life that their sense of hearing, which had gradually come to understand its own futility when the tone of the conversation, at the dinner table, became frivolous or merely mundane, without the two old ladies being able to guide it back to the topic dear to themselves, would leave its receptive channels unemployed, so effectively that they were actually becoming atrophied. So that if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he would have to make use of some such alarm signals as mad doctors adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, as by beating several times on a glass with the blade of a knife, fixing them at the same time with a sharp word and a compelling glance, violent methods which the said doctors are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from force of professional habit or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when, the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present of a case of Asti, my great-aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro in which to the name of a picture then on view in a Corot exhibition were added the words, from the collection of M. Charles Swann, asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I have always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had plenty of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us." For, knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. But we sat silent. My grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swann this reference to him in the Figaro, my great-aunt dissuaded them. Whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked, she would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all, but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well, I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal illusion in a wealth of ingenious circumlocution, that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of managing to induce my father to consent to speak to Swann, not of his wife, but of his daughter, whom he worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. You need only say a word, just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him. My father, however, was annoyed. No, no, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous. But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swann's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. And that was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just M. Swann in the house, Mama did not come up to my room. I did not, at that time, have dinner with the family. I came out to the garden after dinner, and at 9 I said good night and went to bed. But on these evenings I used to dine earlier than the others, and to come in afterwards and sit at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss which Mama used always to leave upon my lips when I was in bed and just going to sleep I had to take with me from the dining room to my own, and to keep inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate, and just on those very evenings when I must needs take most pains to receive it with due formality, I had to snatch it, to seize it instantly and in public, without even having the time or being properly free to apply to what I was doing the punctiliousness which madmen use who compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds while they are shutting a door. We were all in the garden when the double peal of the gate bell sounded shyly. Everyone knew that it must be Swann, and yet they looked at one another inquiringly and sent my grandmother scouting. "See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine," my grandfather warned his 2 sisters-in-law. "You know how good it is, and it is a huge case." "Now, don't start whispering," said my great-aunt. "How would you like to come into a house and find everyone muttering to themselves? Ah, there's M. Swann," cried my father. "Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine tomorrow." My mother fancied that a word from her would wipe out all the unpleasantness which my family had contrived to make Swann feel since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment. But I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her go out of reach of me while I felt that in a few minutes I should have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up, later, to kiss me. "Now, M. Swann," she said, "do tell me about your daughter. I am sure she shows a taste already for nice things, like her papa." "Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda," said my grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon the quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as great poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. "We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves," she said, or rather whispered to Swann. "It is only a mother who can understand. I am sure that hers would agree with me." And so we all sat down round the iron table. I should have liked not to think of the hours of anguish which I should have to spend, that evening, alone in my room, without the possibility of going to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, really, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future which would carry me, as on a bridge, across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look which I shot at my mother, would not allow any other impression to enter. Thoughts did, indeed, enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty, or even of quaintness, by which I might have been distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, by means of a local anesthetic, can look on with a clear consciousness while an operation is being performed upon him and yet feel nothing, I could repeat to myself some favorite lines, or watch my grandfather attempting to talk to Swann about the duc d'Audrefer Pasquier, without being able to kindle any emotion from one or amusement from the other. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swann about that orator when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence which her natural politeness bade her interrupt, addressed the other with, "Just fancy, Flora, I met a young Swedish governess today who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," said her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time either. I met such a clever old gentleman at M. Vinteuil's who knows Maubant quite well, and Maubant has told him every little thing about how he gets up his parts. It is the most interesting thing I ever heard. He is a neighbor of M. Vinteuil's, and I never knew, and he is so nice besides. M. Vinteuil is not the only one who has nice neighbors," cried my Aunt Celine in a voice which seemed loud because she was so timid, and seemed forced because she had been planning the little speech for so long, darting, as she spoke, what she called a significant glance at Swann. And my Aunt Flora, who realized that this veiled utterance was Celine's way of thanking Swann intelligibly for the hostie, looked at him with a blend of congratulation and irony, either just because she wished to underline her sister's little epigram, or because she envied Swann his having inspired it, or merely because she imagined that he was embarrassed, and could not help having a little fun at his expense. I think it would be worthwhile, Flora went on, to have this old gentleman to dinner. When you get him upon Maubant or me, Materna, he will talk for hours on end. That must be delightful, sighed my grandfather, in whose mind nature had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the cooperative movement among the ladies of Sweden or in the methods employed by Maubant to get up his parts, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with a grain of that precious salt which one has oneself to add to taste, in order to extract any savor from a narrative of the private life of Mole or of the Comte de Paris. I say, exclaimed Swann to my grandfather, what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you were asking me just now, for in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in Saint Simon this morning which would have amused you. It is in the volume which covers his mission to Spain, not one of the best, little more in fact than a journal, but at least it is a journal wonderfully well written, which fairly distinguishes it from the devastating journalism that we feel bound to read in these days, morning, noon and night. I do not agree with you. There are some days when I find reading the papers very pleasant indeed. My Aunt Flora broke in, to show Swann that she had read the note about his Corot in the Figaro. Yes, Aunt Celine went one better. When they write about things or people in whom we are interested. I don't deny it, answered Swann in some bewilderment. The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that, every morning, when we tore the wrapper off our paper with fevered hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it, I don't know, shall we say Pascal's Pensées? He articulated the title with an ironic emphasis so as not to appear pedantic. And then, in the gilt and tooled volumes which we open once in 10 years, he went on, showing that contempt for the things of this world which some men of the world like to affect, we should read that the Queen of the Hellenes had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princess de Leon had given a fancy dress ball. In that way we should arrive at the right proportion between information and publicity. But at once regretting that he had allowed himself to speak, even in jest, of serious matters, he added ironically, we are having a most entertaining conversation. I cannot think why we climbed to these lofty summits, and then, turning to my grandfather, well, Saint Simon tells how Maulevrier had had the audacity to offer his hand to his sons. You remember how he says of Maulevrier, never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humor, boorishness, and folly. Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there is something very different, said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swann as well as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Celine began to laugh. Swann was puzzled, but went on. I cannot say whether it was his ignorance or a trap, writes Saint Simon. He wished to give his hand to my children. I noticed it in time to prevent him. My grandfather was already in ecstasies over ignorance or a trap, but Miss Celine, the name of Saint Simon, a man of letters, having arrested the complete paralysis of her sense of hearing, had grown angry. What? You admire that, do you? Well, it is clever enough. But what is the point of it? Does he mean that one man isn't as good as another? What difference can it make whether he is a duke or a groom so long as he is intelligent and good? He had a fine way of bringing up his children, your Saint Simon, if he didn't teach them to shake hands with all honest men. Really and truly, it's abominable. And you dare to quote it? And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be for him, against this opposition, to attempt to get Swann to tell him the stories which would have amused him, murmured to my mother, just tell me again that line of yours which always comforts me so much on these occasions. Oh, yes. What virtues, Lord, thou mockest us abhor. Good, that is, very good. I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when they were at table I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner time, and that Mama, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to give her in public the series of kisses that she would have had in my room. And so I promised myself that in the dining room, as they began to eat and drink and as I felt the hour approach, I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and stealthy in execution, everything that my own efforts could put into it. Would look out very carefully first the exact spot on her cheek where I would imprint it, and would so prepare my thoughts that I might be able, thanks to these mental preliminaries, to consecrate the whole of the minute Mama would allow me to the sensation of her cheek against my lips, as a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only prepares his palette, and from what he remembers and from rough notes does in advance everything which he possibly can do in the sitter's absence. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "The little man looks tired, he'd better go up to bed. Besides, we are dining late tonight." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along, to bed with you." I would have kissed Mama then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone. You've said good night quite enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go on upstairs." And so I must set forth without viaticum, must climb each step of the staircase, against my heart, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by her kiss, given my heart leave to accompany me forth. That hateful staircase, up which I always passed with such dismay, gave out a smell of varnish which had to some extent absorbed, made definite and fixed the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even more cruel to my sensibility because, when it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep with a maddening toothache and are conscious of it only as a little girl whom we attempt, time after time, to pull out of the water, or as a line of Molière which we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up, so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the precise converse of this relief which I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my room invaded my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous almost, a manner at once insidious and brutal as I breathed in, a far more poisonous thing than any moral penetration, the peculiar smell of the varnish upon that staircase. Once in my room I had to stop every loophole, to close the shutters, to dig my own grave as I turned down the bedclothes, to wrap myself in the shroud of my nightshirt. But before burying myself in the iron bed which had been placed there because, on summer nights, I was too hot among the red curtains of the four-poster, I was stirred to revolt, and attempted the desperate stratagem of a condemned prisoner. I wrote to my mother begging her to come upstairs for an important reason which I could not put in writing. My fear was that Françoise, my aunt's cook who used to be put in charge of me when I was at Cambrai, might refuse to take my note. I had a suspicion that, in her eyes, to carry a message to my mother when there was a stranger in the room would appear flatly inconceivable, just as it would be for the doorkeeper of a theater to hand a letter to an actor upon the stage. For things which might or might not be done she possessed a code at once imperious, abundant, subtle, and uncompromising on points themselves imperceptible or irrelevant, which gave it a resemblance to those ancient laws which combined such cruel ordinances as the massacre of infants at the breast with prohibitions of exaggerated refinement, against seething the kid in his mother's milk, or eating of the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh. This code, if one could judge it by the sudden obstinacy which she would put into her refusal to carry out certain of our instructions, seemed to have foreseen such social complications and refinements of fashion as nothing in Françoise's surroundings or in her career as a servant in a village household could have put into her head, and we were obliged to assume that there was latent in her some past existence in the ancient history of France, noble and little understood, just as there is in those manufacturing towns where old mansions still testified to their former courtly days. In this particular instance, the article of her code which made it highly improbable that, barring an outbreak of fire, Françoise would go down and disturb Mamma when M. Swann was there for so unimportant a person as myself was one embodying the respect she showed not only for the family, as for the dead, for the clergy, or for royalty, but also for the stranger within our gates. A respect which I should perhaps have found touching in a book, but which never failed to irritate me on her lips, because of the solemn and gentle tones in which she would utter it, and which irritated me more than usual this evening when the sacred character in which she invested the dinner party might have the effect of making her decline to disturb its ceremonial. But to give myself one chance of success I lied without hesitation, telling her that it was not in the least myself who had wanted to write to Mamma, but Mamma who, on saying good night to me, had begged me not to forget to send her an answer about something she had asked me to find, and that she would certainly be very angry if this note were not taken to her. I think that Françoise disbelieved me, for, like those primitive men whose senses were so much keener than our own, she could immediately detect, by signs imperceptible by the rest of us, the truth or falsehood of anything that we might wish to conceal from her. She studied the envelope for 5 minutes as though an examination of the paper itself and the look of my handwriting could enlighten her as to the nature of the contents, or tell her to which article of her code she ought to refer the matter. Then she went out with an air of resignation which seemed to imply, "What a dreadful thing for parents to have a child like this." A moment later she returned to say that they were still at the ice stage and that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the note at once, in front of everybody, but that when the finger bowls were put round he would find a way of slipping it into Mamma's hand. At once my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer, as it had been a moment ago, until tomorrow that I had lost my mother, for my little line was going to annoy her, no doubt, and doubly so because this contrivance would make me ridiculous in Swann's eyes, but was going all the same to admit me, invisibly and by stealth, into the same room as herself, was going to whisper from me into her ear. For that forbidden and unfriendly dining room, where but a moment ago the ice itself, with burned nuts in it, and the finger bowls seemed to me to be concealing pleasures that were mischievous and of a mortal sadness because Mamma was tasting of them and I was far away, had opened its doors to me and, like a ripe fruit which bursts through its skin, was going to pour out into my intoxicated heart the gushing sweetness of Mamma's attention while she was reading what I had written. Now I was no longer separated from her, the barriers were down, an exquisite thread was binding us. Besides, that was not all, for surely Mamma would come. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagined that Swann would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and had guessed its purpose. Whereas, on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years, and no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that moment so well as himself. To him, that anguish which lies in knowing that the creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not and cannot follow, to him that anguish came through love, to which it is in a sense predestined, by which it must be equipped and adapted. But when, as had befallen me, such an anguish possesses one's soul before love has yet entered into one's life, then it must drift, awaiting love's coming, vague and free, without precise attachment, at the disposal of one sentiment today, of another tomorrow, of filial piety or affection for a comrade. And the joy with which I first bound myself apprentice, when Françoise returned to tell me that my letter would be delivered, Swann, too, had known well that false joy which a friend can give us, or some relative of the woman we love, when on his arrival at the house or theatre where she is to be found, for some ball or party or first night, at which he is to meet her, he sees us wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity of communicating with her. He recognizes us, greets us familiarly, and asks what we are doing there. And when we invent a story of having some urgent message to give to his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be more simple, takes us in at the door, and promises to send her down to us in 5 minutes. How much we love him, as at that moment I loved Françoise, the good-natured intermediary who by a single word has made supportable, human, almost propitious the inconceivable, infernal scene of gaiety in the thick of which we had been imagining swarms of enemies, perverse and seductive, beguiling away from us, even making laugh at us, the woman whom we love. If we are to judge of them by him, this relative who has accosted us and who is himself an initiate in those cruel mysteries, then the other guests cannot be so very demoniacal. Those inaccessible and torturing hours into which she had gone to taste of unknown pleasures, behold, a breach in the wall, and we are through it. Behold, one of the moments whose series will go to make up their sum, a moment as genuine as the rest, if not actually more important to ourselves because our mistress is more intensely a part of it. We picture it to ourselves, we possess it, we intervene upon it, almost we have created it. Namely, the moment in which he goes to tell her that we are waiting there below. And very probably the other moments of the party will not be essentially different, will contain nothing else so exquisite or so well able to make us suffer, since this kind friend has assured us that, of course, she will be delighted to come down. It will be far more amusing for her to talk to you than to be bored up there. Alas! Swann had learned by experience that the good intentions of a third party are powerless to control a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued even into a ballroom by a man whom she does not love. Too often, the kind friend comes down again alone. My mother did not appear, but with no attempt to safeguard my self-respect, which depended upon her keeping up the fiction that she had asked me to let her know the result of my search for something or other, made Françoise tell me, in so many words, there is no answer. Words I have so often, since then, heard the hall porters in mansions, and the flunkies in gambling clubs and the like, repeat to some poor girl, who replies in bewilderment, "What? He said nothing? It's not possible. You did give him my letter, didn't you? Very well, I shall wait a little longer." And just as she invariably protests that she does not need the extra gas which the porter offers to light for her, and sits on there, hearing nothing further, except an occasional remark on the weather which the porter exchanges with a messenger whom he will send off suddenly, when he notices the time, to put some customer's wine on the ice. So, having declined Françoise's offer to make me some tea or to stay beside me, I let her go off again to the servants' hall, and lay down and shut my eyes, and tried not to hear the voices of my family who were drinking their coffee in the garden.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.